Can we really trust people to do the right thing for the right reasons? Today, investigative journalists have shocked the public with reports of betrayal of trust by FBI officers and United States attorneys. Each generation learns a disappointing history lesson about the human condition, that every level of government has failed at ethical moral decision-making. Citizens are dependent upon leadership to make informed decisions that do not adversely affect organizational culture, constituents, stakeholders, and the public. In America, we have experienced violations by government officers in duty of care and negligence during emergency responses, such as Hurricane Katrina in 2005, NASA's deadly disasters with the Challenger in 1986, and the Columbia Shuttle in 2003. We have also entered in a new era of killing civilians in America when the Dallas police used robotic deadly force against a shooter in 2016. Researchers who examine organizational cultures and decision-making understand the ethical dilemmas faced by the leadership and bring to the public's attention significant concerns about safety. For example, let us compare and contrast the organizational culture and the leadership of three incidents we just mentioned about NASA, New Orleans, and Dallas. Although there are differences in leadership and organizational culture between these incidents, some of the factors affecting the decision-making process are similar. In the case of NASA, reported in the video Beyond the Moon by the History Channel, I was reminded of my own experience from 2000 and 2003 when I directed education outreach for NASA at headquarters in Washington, D.C., and at the Goddard Space Flight Center for the Earth Science Technology Office, named ESTO. As a NASA employee, I understood that failure was not an option when Congress mandated that we apply our technology as science for society in mitigating risk of burns for firefighters, vegetation signatures for farmers, and atmospheric chemistry for volcanoes and ozone. We examined models for early warning systems, for real threats from storms and risk of floods. It was more than tracking data. We also had a critical mission to inspire the next generation to keep the exploration of technology competitive in the global market. To maintain this shared mission, we missed birthdays, concerts, and Little League games, and the wives and children made sacrifices of their own for a mission greater than themselves. Examining the case of NASA, in terms of the Columbia fatal disaster, the accurate and transparent communication was missing, which involved the leadership of NASA's contract office. The January 1986 accident investigation indicated that there was a broken safety culture. The truth is that political pressure was placed on leadership to launch before engineers checked off readiness levels. I was personally aware of some of these issues involved in both the Challenger and Columbia fatal disaster because I edited Steve Agee's book titled For the Right Reasons that reported problems in the culture of leadership in government contractors. Steve was hired by the FBI to conduct the Thiokol interviews and investigation of engineers in Utah. These engineers put in writing, by emails and reports, their own disapproval of the O-rings months before the launch. After the report, Steve and his family were transferred for safety reasons to Australia and the New Zealand area. I met Steve and his family again outside of Auckland and Rotorua on the North Island. What this NASA investigation did not reveal to the public is that 2 months prior to the launch, there was a strong conflict in values, integrity, and ethical decision-making of leaders at Thiokol who wanted to delay the launch because of economic drivers of penalties for delayed contract deliverables to NASA. In fact, 3 engineers refused to sign off on the O-rings and resigned. It was a matter of the problems within the leadership that could have been resolved because it was the issue of integrity of Thiokol not wanting to admit that their O-rings were not reliable. They accepted a foolish risk when they knew the burn rate and potential leak in the seal would be escalated with the command to throttle up, which led to the explosion. When you closely watch the video between launch seconds 55 and 65, you'll see that the leak began after the ability to evacuate. Leroy Kane, the flight director in February 2003, reminds us that ethical decisions influence people every day in every industry. It is the nature of leaders, like NASA mission controllers, who hold our lives in their hands, who feel powerless when the information from engineers is ignored by contract decision makers. In 1993, the same blunder occurred, with the Hubble telescope mirror requiring 35 hours of spacewalk repairs. Although every minute is planned and choreographed, it is clear that these engineers did not communicate well, and they let their egos and contract profits obstruct their ability to make suitable decisions that cost millions of dollars of taxpayer investments. My personal perspective about the ethical, moral decision-making failure in NASA leadership is that it began with the integrity of the contract officers, because there was not sufficient enforcement of the value of life for the astronauts, the mission team, the trust of the public taxpayer, and the world watching the performance of engineers. NASA contractors did not properly navigate the risk of Thiokol lying about readiness and about the political pressure to go ahead in dangerous circumstances. In fact, Thiokol fired the engineers who wrote the reports to not yet use the O-rings. The failure in ethical framework and values of the contract leaders in the NASA situation directly influenced their perspective and duty in their decision-making. I believe the only right response was for the NASA contract office, which purchased the O-rings from Thiokol, was to question the potential for pressure to produce at the expense of the product not being ready. There was a profit-driven transaction. Decision-making model used was not factoring the consequences of the faulty product. I believe the ethical issue pertaining to this NASA incident is criminal, not merely a miscommunication, because there is evidence of withholding the engineers' reports from NASA contract officers and leadership. The culture of NASA is highly selective for characteristics of integrity, team trust, and the dedication of commitment to excellence. This culture is in contrast, in opposition to the culture of Thiokol, which behaved with the value of greed, expediency, and disregard for the lives of the astronauts, the NASA engineers, and public trust. Organizational culture is a shared set of values, beliefs, and principles. The organizational failure of the Thiokol subculture is not international as much as it is represented by a separate, unaccountable culture. Although the main office of Morton Thiokol is in Chicago, the favoritism in selecting unqualified employees has proved to be a significant problem. New leaders at Thiokol have not made much effort to be transparent and repair the systemic dysfunction within the corporation. They have a history within their organization that remains ingrained for many generations, and there is not evidence that Thiokol has learned a valuable lesson. I believe that the NASA contract office was negligent for not verifying and validating through on-site inspections that the O-rings, in fact, were not reliable and ready for use. I believe that the NASA's contract office, which I have personally worked with as a contractor in 2003, was negligent in honestly evaluating the risk of difference in culture, and they failed to assess the risk of violation by the contractor, Morton Thiokol. In this NASA scenario, if I had been in a leadership position, I would have acted differently. I would have found ways to push back the senator's political pressure to launch only to gain their own political and public media points. I would have prosecuted Thiokol in a manner that would have caused future companies, such as the leadership at Enron, to be very concerned about violating public trust. The violation of duty by the NASA contract officer is an unfortunate component of the human condition. Today, it is unremarkable to hear a report claiming a particular corporate culture is unethical. It is unclear when employees as members to a corporation become liable for sharing the intrinsic organizational values as members that underpin organizational goals. Because moral responsibility is generated and distributed in business organizations, and employees who participate in that culture acquire a degree of moral responsibility for the wrongdoing that results from the activities and behavior of that organization. They are complicit in the wrongdoing because they helped facilitate it, and they gave each other reasons for acting in line with those values. The NASA-Thiokol agreement failed the ethical decision-making process. They failed to clarify the problem and identify the uncertainty. They failed to describe the unethical considerations, and they failed to recognize issues and preferences. They failed to make a list of risks and consequences, and failed to look at the applicable rules and duties in the principles involved. They failed to choose a solution from a list of options, and they failed to implement and evaluate the action plans, and they did not look for moral distress. So let us consider a different culture of ethical leadership. Military commanders often consult their staff judge advocates, especially in the escalation of conflict. Legal advice is essential to effective combat operations. They say law decides what is right or wrong in the view of the public. They say the law is sometimes upheld as the guardian of ethical issues and moral problems. Understanding that their actions will finally be judged by standards set by law, commanders must understand the parameters of an action prior to committing those solutions. With legal analysis, they are able to make better decisions. This is relevant in the 2015 issue of Business Ethics Quarterly that was published and written by Professor Dempsey from Warwick University, who discusses moral responsibility, shared values, and corporate culture. Dempsey explains how business organizations have cultures that behave like tribes, in which they behave in an unethical manner, and such as the collapse of Enron and the NASA Thiokol problem. In corporate wrongdoing, it is often the case that many people may be held individually morally responsible, based on an assessment of who participated in the relevant actions. Actions, or failures to act, in a corporate environment can be morally wrong because they exemplify certain values. An account of moral responsibility in business organizations is based in the idea that individuals acquire responsibility for the wrongdoing of others by actively sharing values with them. For example, Margaret Gilbert draws an account of joint commitments to explain that individuals in an organization may come to share values, certain behavioral habits, such as fixed pricing, or bonuses at the expense of customer service, and maximizing profits at the exclusion of other goals for consumer interests and perhaps environmental concerns. Employees who habitually engage in value-laden practices and behaviors tacitly enter into agreements to promote those values that are significantly robust to be complicit to normative commitments to organizational outcomes. Negligent ethical decision-making contributes to deadly disasters, evidenced in the video True Colors about the 2005 Hurricane Katrina. The interviews investigated the prior awareness of EPA for the threats along the coastline and the warnings of vulnerability to sea level changes from storm surges. It is interesting to see how Governor Christie in New Jersey immediately began a rebuilding campaign as soon as he heard about the problem. His leadership team responded differently than the city of New Orleans to the impact of hurricane threats in protecting their vulnerable citizens on the coastline. However, most informative is the investigators' report that identified across the Hudson River in New York City a different kind of leadership that was accountable, reliable, and worthy of public trust and respect. New York leaders took a different approach to the problem. They were willing to say, "I do not know," and we need to seek out people who do know and already have best practices in place with experience in flood problems. New York leaders contacted Dutch experts and listened to what worked well in the Netherlands. In the video, The Perfect Union, that reviewed the situation in the city of New Orleans, they described their personal experience of major flooding in which 1,500 people lost their lives, hundreds of thousands of people lost their homes, and hundreds of the deceased bodies were floating down their street. Their disappointment in government response required men to band together to go out in their own boats to rescue families. They felt abandoned by their government, by their city and county representatives. They asked, how could the government rescue services that they trusted delay when lives were at stake? They felt that their own lives did not matter, as the president flew over in Air Force One, as a sign that their leader was disconnected from their pain and suffering on the ground. They felt a racial wound, as if the landscape of culture had changed, and that poor black people no longer mattered. In David Marcello's report of the systemic ethics reform in Katrina's aftermath, He begins by quoting John Barry's warning after the Mississippi flood of 1927. He said, "The rising tide changed America. The struggle began as one man against nature and became one of man against man, because the flood brought with it a human storm, in which honor and money collided, white and black collided, regional and national power collided, and it shook America." In 2005, Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita devastated the landscape of the Gulf Coast region. The public discovered that there was serious wrongdoing about their government handling procurement. The U.S. Attorney's Office brought several high-profile prosecutions for public corruption and sent to prison officials for accepting bribes and gifts from contractors. The Ethics Review Board and Office of Inspector General recommended ethics reform that followed a tortuous path against the unethical system that benefited the political patronage of elected officials. The Katrina and Rita disasters impacted state politics in Louisiana as well, and the newly elected Governor Jindal made ethics reform the focus of his first month after his inauguration, in which all public servants would be required to disclose any conflict of interest they might have and recuse themselves from participating in procurement transactions. Disasters introduce uncertainty into the established order to create opportunities for change and the safeguard of public integrity. Katrina was considered the catalyst that led to implementation of professional service procurement reform. In July 2016, Ms. Edwards reported that a Dallas police chief opened up a new ethical concern when he deliberately detonated a robotic bomb that killed a gunman. She said that this is the first time that civilian police have used a robot to kill an American civilian on American soil. Dr. Peter Acero, an assistant professor at the New York School of Public Engagement and a co-founder of the International Committee for Robotic Arms Control, said, "The situation definitely raises interesting questions about the use of robots in future domestic conflict, such as school shootings." Dallas Police Chief David Brown said, "Other options would have exposed our officers to greater danger." And from a utilitarian perspective, legal scholars told Time reporters that from a moral position, this case was no different than a sniper killing an active shooter. Dan Montgomery, a former police chief and expert on policy and police practice, said the officers acted according to agreed upon rules of engagement, and that the taxpayer who entrusts us with deadly force knows that we must neutralize that threat. Cynthia Lum, director of the Center for Evidence-Based Crime Policy at George Mason University, here in Fairfax, Virginia, noted that the Dallas Police Force's highly unusual use of a robot did merit deadly force. However, Keith Abney, a professor of ethics and emerging sciences at California Polytech State University, said, "The police officer's decision to use the robot to kill the suspect, in this case, doesn't seem fundamentally ethically different from any other distance weapon." He asked the Time magazine reporter, why couldn't the police use the robot to dispense knockout gas or some other non-lethal agent to capture the suspect instead of killing him? What he did not consider and compare to other leadership cultures, perhaps in China, Russia, and Iran, with their thousands of years of practical experience in managing people, is that they value life differently when considering the duty of stewardship and protecting the garden that we share together, such that the taxpayer is not burdened to keep alive a willful, rebellious, defiant threat to the community, especially when he may not have redeemable qualities after prison and rehab. Gloria Brown Marshall, an associate professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, said, "The incident was most concerning because of what it means for future cases." She asked the Times reporter, "What are the parameters surrounding the use of such technology on civilian soil? Is American law enforcement now using robotic technology on civilian population as a means of easing into a civil war to manage the conflict between the cultural value systems. The organizational culture and the leadership of NASA are different than the city of New Orleans and the Dallas Police Department. The different effects on the decision-making are significant in both disaster incidents. In regard to changes in the complexity of the American culture and leadership, there is evidence of a civil war happening in the hearts and minds of program directors of graduate medical education in hospitals, who are wrestling with the concept of ethical decision-making, because the culture uses transactional leadership instead of developing junior doctors through transformational leadership and shepherding their tasks with deliberate mentoring that is necessary to navigate dysfunctional systems. The battleground wrestles with the value of preparing next-generation physicians without putting them through 80 hours a week and 20-hour shifts. That adversely affects the patient, the safety of nurses, staff, and the resident in trusting the hospital not to harm them and burn them out. The resident is not at liberty to pursue medical education outside of the traditional apprentice-style practice, in which the hospital benefits from the cheap labor of work-study students. A shepherd of residents knows to defy the predatory wolves that prey upon inexperienced employees. The shepherd knows that the resident sheep are accountable and responsible for the patients. The shepherd is able to recognize a wolf in a sheep's white coat, and is able to express compassion and encouragement to that sheep when others do not understand. Responsible leadership reminds us of our purpose and direction. We're living in a time of change and disruption that creates a world of uncertainty and opportunity. A fresh perspective is necessary in making ethical decisions because it explores the tough issues across disciplines. That is why we need to empower open collaboration and innovation, and recognize the vulnerable voice of people at risk, such as medical residents putting in 80 hours a week, and used as cheap labor by a medical machine. What the public does not know is that there are each year economic drivers and financial incentives to these hospitals in which our Federal Agency for Health and Human Services pays over $100,000 per medical resident each year. I believe a more ethical and moral policy should require that a resident be placed on the board of directors of every teaching hospital, and that board to be required each month to hear a report from the quality improvement officer and the patient safety officer. This is necessary to make a safer institution in which the voice of residents has been ignored. We reach our full potential when we work together. Graduate medical education will not improve beyond this level of hopelessness for residents until hospitals realize that by listening to champions of education, they will enable responsible health care for the nation. In conclusion, America's future in the global market depends upon our preparation of the next generation to have dedication to excellence, moral and ethical framework, and the capacity to make decisions that preserve public trust in corporations and government. Preparing the next generation of physicians requires dedication to excellence, which allows us to collaborate with each generation to make a difference and inspire improvements. In the real world, there is no such thing as zero risk. Robotics does not replace the human aspect of exploring and performing better medicine. Residents are made to become physicians by responsible leaders putting them through experiences of risk. It is time for America to take the next step in medical technology to detect and mitigate the risks in residents' schedules. Thank you.